In the 1800s, British railway pioneers were national heroes. From this crumbling factory in Newcastle, George and Robert Stephenson built the machines that changed the world. Soon these rusting winches will be buffed up and the site restored with lottery money. Gambling on leisure and heritage is now a safer bet than on iron and steel. But at one time in these drawing offices, Robert Stephenson designed the rocket and sent the Industrial Revolution into orbit.
This is locomotion. This is what George Stephenson built 4 years before the rocket in 1825. So this isn't the rocket, and rocket wasn't the first. This is a beam engine going for a walk. In fact, it's two little beam engines. And driving this is like driving a colliery winding engine. The only awkward bit is you've got to do two at once.
Before George Stephenson became known as the father of the railways, he learnt his trade by getting his hands dirty. Working as an engineer in the coalfields of northeast England, he was surrounded by winding engines which pumped out waterlogged pits. By miniaturising cylinders like this and fixing them on small high-pressure boilers, he created a simple piece of locomotive machinery. But Stephenson's real flair was for spotting other people's good ideas.
Stephenson was not that original. What he did best was draw together the ideas from other people. There's Murray's slide valve, not Stephenson's. Here's a boiler. This is a Trevithick boiler. Fremantle valve gear, not Stephenson. It goes on and on. This is not pure Stephenson genius.
Stephenson's spectacular machine was financed by a group of local coal barons. But they weren't interested in providing passengers with pleasant-day returns. The locomotive was developed to replace the horse and shift their coal.
Nearly all the early experiments were concerned with industrial movement of goods, basically coal. They had a lot of coal, it was very heavy, it had to be moved, and an engine could do the job. But this was a great roaring, raging beast. Cinders coming out from the chimney, rattling over these very short lengths of track, and they made a huge impression.
Before fire-spitting machines took to the rails, man's greatest invention, the wheel, had been getting stuck in primordial sludge for years. Just south of Newcastle, industrial archaeologists have discovered a relic from the very birth of railways, a wooden wagonway. For centuries, horse-drawn wagons took coal from the pits to major rivers in the northeast. From there, it was shipped down south and abroad. Until now, not much was known about the technology of early rail. Incredibly, this 18th century wagonway has many of the features of its modern-day counterpart. The roughly hewn oak tracks, with a gauge of 4'2", are fitted to even more basic sleepers. As today, guide rails are used to prevent derailment, but the most remarkable feature are the crude points. No moving parts here. Early railway workers had to heave the wagons from track to track. By the early 1800s, metal was already beginning to replace the wooden wagonway, but the first iron rails stopped some engines in their tracks.
One of the great disadvantages of the early locomotives was they tended to break the track. The track was cast iron in short sections. The locomotives were unsprung, and they would shatter the cast iron rails quite easily. There was a natural conundrum that you really wanted the weight of the engine because that could pull more weight itself. It had adhesion. However, too much weight then broke the track. And it took really a lot of experiments and a lot of time to get over that natural problem.
At the end of the last century, designers didn't make daily maintenance easy for the long-suffering engine driver. As the demand for more efficient engines grew, Robert Stephenson pushed steam technology to the limit. And although Robert died in 1859, his pioneering designs lived on.
The A5 was built in 1883 for the Concert Iron Company. There were a lot of very tight curves at Concert, so it needed to be a very short wheelbase. The overall length of the locomotive is 29 feet, and the wheelbase is only 10'9". All of the wheels are in front of the firebox, which gives this long overhang at the back. Unfortunately, with the short wheelbase and the long overhang, it gives a very rough ride in the cab. The back end sways back and forward like this when you're going round curves.
The A5's oiling points were not designed for the faint-hearted.
To oil this engine up, you have to get between the frames underneath the boiler. Now, there's not a great deal of room there. The oiling is very difficult. To get into the frames, you've either got to get into a pit and reach right up, or you've got to lie along the footplate, get yourself jammed between the footplate and the boiler, and then stretch in and get very long arms to get in with the oil. The designers weren't particularly keen on drivers' comfort.
Oh well, it was probably oily enough. Though some aspects of the A5 were a pain, others were pure pleasure.
George Stephenson, he had the idea that you just needed one large tube through the boiler to heat the water up. This is evident in locomotion. Robert Stephenson, his idea was to have a lot of smaller tubes through the boiler, make them as long as possible, and get a lot of heating surface. Now this locomotive, this one has 198 small tubes in, so you can imagine the amount of heating surface you can get off that as compared with only one tube in. It's quite a pioneering design, this one, in that these long tubes allowed it to have a pressure of 140 pounds per square inch for steam, which made it a very powerful locomotive, ideally suited for moving the heavy trains up at Concert. Industrial locomotives were designed mainly for one-man operation. The design is quite a classic, really, but this one was built in 1883, yet the Concert Iron Company still in 1941 sent the drawings for this locomotive to Robert Stephenson and Hawthorne's of Newcastle and had further locomotives built to exactly the same design.
Featuring massive cylinders and weighing 61 tons, the first Lambton tank was introduced in 1904. With as much capacity for onboard coal and water as engines with a tender, Robert Stephenson and Co. were onto a winner. It doesn't take long for Andrew Robertson and Harry Hargrave to relight their memories of working these mainline monsters.
All right there, Harry.
All right, away. Whistle and go.
All right, the board's go.
Handbrakes off.
There we go. This is the steam brake. We release it to go forward. We have the reversing handle here in the forward position. This is the regulator, and we give it a little gentle pull, and now we are off. We have to keep an eye on the gauge glasses. The fireman watches them to say that the level of water is all right, and the steam.
Fireman's job to watch the steam, keep the boiler full. This is the ejector. Put the water in the boiler. Let's fill the boiler up. Then it's a matter of putting coal on and keep the steam up. Watch where you're going there.
A driver using too much steam was never popular with the man shoveling coal.
You see, he's got it in full gear there. Now you can leave it in full gear, steam on, and he's using the steam like I didn't know what. You're lashing the coal on. But if he notches it up, which he should do, pulls it back into... That's notching up. And that's cutting the steam off earlier, so you're not using as much steam. It's allowing the steam to expand in the cylinders earlier, like. And you're not using the steam then, of course. The fireman had a good job then.
We got so used to them that we knew what engine it was by the sound. Some of them engine whistles used to have a very low tone, and you could tell which one. Number 20, for instance, was one of those. Steam engines was much more alive to us.
Steam engines had a character about them. You could get the same type of engine, you got to work it different, fire it different, had a character, and you used to talk to you when you were working them, really. You know, as they were speeding along the rails there.
Steam was a powerful thing, and we thought maybe diesels wouldn't be so powerful. A lot of the chaps didn't want the diesels when they came.
In the 20s, a lot of people decided that steam was a little bit obsolete and dirty, and they decided that diesel would be the answer.
George Cowell helped build some of Britain's first diesel electrics in 1933.
My generation were the last of the Victorians in the sense of heavy engineering. When I started work as an apprentice, you had to learn very, very quickly. Consequently, at 20-year-old, I built this loco. Nobody had ever built like it before. We were like George or Robert Stevens. We had nobody to follow. Eh? And some of the things you used to get up to build some of these locos were really astronomical and quite dangerous at times. Eventually we got into a rhythm and a way of doing it, but I was still a steam man at heart. It was a very, very successful little loco. There were various types of them made over the years. Some for India, some with a 5'6" gauge, some with 3'6" gauge. They were a little bit before that time because coal was so cheap and people wouldn't change over from the steam to the diesel, even though they were cheaper to operate. Of the 6 people, still 2 survived. And it makes me feel very old and very, very proud of being associated with them.
With the advent of diesel, Britain's industrial revolution came full circle. In the greatest railway irony of all, coal, the inspiration for Britain's loco pioneers last century, was still so plentiful by the 1950s that the need for progress to modern fuels was ignored. Steam engineers fought stubbornly for an outmoded power.
It was quite a severe battle, and it was a battle that was being lost because diesels were taking over. After all, you get under a diesel locomotive, you can switch on and go. With a steam locomotive, this morning we've spent 2.5 hours preparing this one before it can go and do any work. In the previous century, we had the locomotive as a new device which was taking over from the horse. Here we've got the last stage in the development of the locomotive in an industrial sense, and this one was trying to stop the ingress of diesel and electric traction.
This engine was one of 5 built for the Steel Company of Wales. But Britain's cutting-edge steam engines were seen as a bit of a joke.
This is a Bagnall locomotive that was built to compete with the diesel market, and it was actually built in 1950. And it incorporates a lot of features like this Walschaerts valve gear that we find more in mainline steam locomotives, not in industrial locomotives. It also has things like roller bearings, which are quite unusual in industrial locomotives, which gives this engine a nice smooth movement.
There was no clambering about with dirty oil cans on the Bagnall. With a delicate top-up of the oil feeder, it was ready to go.
The self-oiling system pumps oil from the lubricator around the locomotive to the cylinders and the glands and just keeps the moving parts well lubricated through the action of the locomotive itself.
In the decade Russian rocket scientists prepared to blast animals into space, engineers from Stafford were still burning coal and boiling water. Stuck in a Victorian time warp, but still desperate to keep pace with the times, the Bagnall was stuffed with innovative knickknacks. Never again would a driver have to rake out his firebox after a long day. But mod cons like this just proved the absurdity of trying to compete with 20th century machines. The spark had left Britain's locomotive trade, and the Industrial Revolution had burnt itself out.
This was a hotbed of the Industrial Revolution. We were the pioneers. We were the people who invented the steam locomotive. We were the people who were producing steam locomotives, and the whole world was coming to us. By 1950, the whole thing had turned round. We were actually competing in the wrong area, looking at steam locomotives and trying to develop them further, when the development was with diesel-electric locomotives and electric locomotives. This then was the end of the line for industrial steam.
In 1907, Britain manufactured 1,800 locos. Today, we make only a handful. But the legacy left by the pioneers of the North East is huge. What started as a coal-carrying pump on wheels triggered a revolution that shook the world.
You're working under extreme pressure in London.
I like to get out into the countryside.
I don't want to live where I work.
Used to leave about 6:30 in the morning and get home about 7:30.
It's nice to be able to come home, relax, get off the train, you smell the sea air and you think,
I like to go back and do my shopping on a Saturday morning up to town.
It's a nice area where I live, and that's where I want to be.
Every working day, almost 500,000 commuters pass through London's train stations. Few ever stop their daydreaming to consider the extraordinary machine that makes their lifestyle possible. But London's railways were not built for commuters.
In the beginning, the whole system operated by steam. There would be smoke and particles of dirt coming through the window, so that you would make sure that if you wanted the window down, you would sit back to engine rather than facing the direction of motion.
But a few specks of soot was a small price to pay to get out of filthy and overcrowded central London.
I moved from the eastern side of London to the far west of the London region, to the limits of the old county of Middlesex. It meant travelling from Baker Street or Great Portland Street to Willesden Green, to Wembley, to Harrow-on-the-Hill.
And so on down the Metropolitan line, a railway with remarkable ambitions. In the mid-19th century railway boom, the Met was part of a grand plan to link Birmingham, London and through a tunnel, Paris. Sadly, the Met never reached Paris, but it did link London with the countryside.
And I alighted at Eastcote Station, which is one of the little hamlets to the east of Ruislip,
where Len Street found a new community being pioneered.
Londoners played, worked and travelled. It was the age of Metroland.
Metroland was the collection of commuter towns that sprang up along the old Met Railway. By the 20s, suburbia had been created. For its residents, it seemed to offer a better way of life. For the Met, it meant radical modernisation. Having laid power rails along its line, the Met built fleets of electric locomotives. This is the only survivor of the most successful fleet, introduced in 1922.
I don't suppose there's many Met drivers that actually drove these in service. I mean, I'm getting on to 77.
The last time Don Batchelor piloted an electric loco was almost 40 years ago.
Well, this is your controller, and you put your key in there. Right, that's the first notch. That's in series. Build it up. They were slow off the mark because you were full of 6 coaches behind them, which was dead weight, nothing pushing. Then we put it over into full. That's full parallel. That's off. And it feels lovely. Though I wish I was back on it again now. Oh, yeah. And their top speed, I suppose you, on the downhill from Finchley Road to Wembley, on the down gradient, you could get round about the 60 mark.
The trouble was that getting them up to 60 was the easy part.
They were difficult to stop in exactly the right place. Oh yes, yeah. I mean, you've got to think of the weight behind you and the system on the track, the greasy valves, all those things come into it. You didn't overshoot naturally when you ran into Baker Street, number 1 or 4 platform, because it's a dead end.
And dead ends were not the only danger.
On these, it's all 630 volt circuits, and even your lights are all the same. And that's why we used to have hats with insulated inside, so you could pull your mains out and you change the fuses and that with using your hat. On this particular day, I grabbed hold of this mains here and my finger touched that. Oh, loading, because down I went and I came round a bit and I could smell burning. I felt my hair. I thought it burnt my hair off. But it nasty burns, all blister up here. That was on Sarah Siddons and all this particular loco. So I wasn't very pleased with that.
The Metropolitan line was once a role model for London's commuter railways. Then in 1933, it was absorbed by the London Underground, and its trains have since become more and more like tubes. Old Met drivers called tube trains tin cans, and it's hard to imagine these 30-year-old A60s inspiring social change. But mass transit has changed Londoners' lives. This is a garden on the Becontree estate at London's eastern edge. In the 1930s, Becontree was the world's largest housing estate and offered the dream of suburbia, even to the poor, like Phoebe Kirk and her family.
We were living in Islington, in 2 semi-basement rooms.
Then Phoebe's baby son David got pneumonia and was dying in the Victorian slums.
The hospital got in touch with Dagenham and they found us a place, found us a cell. We came down here October the 1st, 1931. Felt a different world, different altogether. Own toilet, own everything. You could make your own rules, do what you wanted. Like heaven, a fairyland.
Becontree existed because it lay on the railway between Southend and Fenchurch Street. And for under a shilling, a workman could commute into the city, as Phoebe's husband Alfred did.
When we came down here, he gave up smoking to pay the fare because money was very sparse in those days.
The East was traditionally the poorer side of London, and life here was always a struggle for economic survival. But local commuters like Barry Flaxman believed there was no excuse for late trains.
The line came to Southend-on-Sea, just up the road here, in 1856. It's been neglected from every point of view, from a financial, from a rolling stock, from a locomotive point of view, and until very, very recently, it's been neglected from a management point of view.
The neglect began in the depressed 1930s, when the line's owners, the huge LMS conglomerate, broke a promise made to the Southend Corporation to electrify.
LMS did nothing right the way through until 1933, when it was decided, the corporation decided they would really put on every form of legal pressure they could, and the LMS said, right, we'll build you 37 special locomotives for the line.
The locos were filmed by Peter Peyton, who commuted behind them. He was a train spotter, and so he noticed that these locos were rather special.
The locomotives, of which 2500 was the first one, I would regard as possibly the finest suburban tank engines that ever ran in this country. They could move 300 to 400 ton trains, reach maximum speeds of, if pushed a bit, between 80 and 90 miles an hour. I can't run at a speed of 83. They could accelerate, say, with a 350 ton train, from a standing start at a place like Upminster to 32, 34 miles an hour in the first minute, and up to, say, 42, 44 miles an hour in the second minute.
Not exactly hair-raising, but fast for a steam train, because while most locos had just 2 cylinders, one on each side, the 2500 type was built like an express, with an extra 3rd cylinder in the middle.
The 3-cylinder arrangement gives almost a perfect power per revolution of the wheel. When you've got a 2-cylinder, you've got a little bit of unevenness which will throw an engine into a slip. But these type of engine will work a train of 11 coaches out of a station on a wet rail, possibly without any slip at all, quit an electric train.
But the LMS was competing against a rival route to Southend. The ex-LNER line, running from Southend to Liverpool Street, was one of the first to get power cables. And by 1949, it already had a new electric train, the 306.
In comparison to what the people used to run on, these things were a breath of fresh air. Power-operated sliding doors, light and airy full-length compartments, luggage racks. It couldn't seat that many people. The total number of people on this 3-coach train was only around about 166. And there was about 40 or 64 people in this compartment, but it was built for mass transit because you had the strap hangers for people to hang on to. Of course, as time went on, these became a bit dated, but the people used to still stand and wait for these rather than some of the newer stock because of the comfortable seating. The old bouncy seats, all sprung cushions.
The 306 could accelerate from 0 to 60 in under 90 seconds and was much quicker than the steamers on the old LMS route.
If you stood at one end of the vehicle and looked down here and it was doing full speed of about 65, 70 miles an hour, the sight of about, I don't know what we got here, about 60 odd people all bouncing in unison was quite hilarious to see them all bouncing from side to side as one. It's quite funny.
With the electrification, you could safely sit down in a carriage and get out without having to sort of send your suit to the cleaners, which one had to do quite frequently on a steam train.
And white shirts got absolutely filthy.
Absolutely
Cuffs were filthy and collars.
Cuffs and collars would continue to get filthy on the old steam LMS route between Southend and Fenchurch Street because it had not been electrified after nationalisation. In fact, it had become BR's misery line.
Well, it was extremely poor, and of course people expected so much more. The war having been over, they expected the return of locomotives that would do the job, better rolling stock from somewhere, and that generally there would be some management attention given to a very important commuter line. In fact, this never materialised. I was lucky enough to live right overlooking the line, and being a student I had a fair amount of spare time, so I kept very accurate records of what was happening. The origin of the train either at Fenchurch Street, Tilbury or Shoebury. Perhaps we better now just wait for the 1340 out on its way to Shoebury. Then I entered how late it was running against the schedule. Here we are in August. Trains running 20 late, 10 late, 34, 27, 19, 19, 21, 18 late, 31 and so on and so on. So I started writing letters to the press. Mr. Henry Channon MP, the Council and the Railway Travellers Association should immediately combine to apply pressure on the apathetic railway company. It's the obvious solution to the present disgraceful situation. Yours sincerely, Barry K. Flaxman. And I believe that the letters which I was putting in the press at around about the age of 18 didn't read quite as if they were from somebody of my age, rather of an old disgruntled gentleman, perhaps in his 50s or 60s. And finally the mayor and town clerk said, well, you better come along with us to the railway executive and express your views and tell him how to do it better.
Barry Flaxman devised a new timetable so that fast trains weren't stuck behind slow ones, and trains no longer detoured beyond Southend to get their windows shut. It worked until 1961, when electricity finally reached the misery line. The spearhead of electricity looked old-fashioned, with its slammed doors and compartments, but these 302s reduced the journey time from Southend to Fenchurch Street by up to 25 minutes. And the timetables changed again, so commuters could make all sorts of new connections.
First day of the electrification, we all travelled up together, and I think it was probably about the second or third day. A friend of mine who used to join us at Lee was on Lee Station, and she met Tony on the station, who didn't travel with us at the time. And she said to him, "You travelling up on your own?" So he said, yes. So she said, well, come along and join the crowd in our carriage.
I got in and found there was a seat available, and of course, going up on those trains, on the commuter trains, we used to pass the time, very often a number of us, by playing cards. And my first introduction to Chris was basically asking her to move from a corner seat so that I could sit opposite the chaps I was going to play with, meeting with a smart refusal. Well, one thing led to another, as you will appreciate, and we started going out together.
And we were married about a year later. And we've now been married 32 years.
No complaints. I'm forced to say that, of course. And 2 grown-up daughters.
Ocean Beach, Rhyl, North Wales. This is Rhyl's misery line, where passengers insist on a hellish time.
But it's more than a business, it's a way of life.
The building itself is probably 35 years of age, but the cars on the track, they go back to probably early 30s. My brothers ran it before me, and now it's my turn. I've got another 50 years to go, I think, or something like that. I get a gold medal in it. They put me inside. The rest of the family are in there.
It costs Noah Robinson's thrill-seeking passengers 80p to ride 100 yards of twisting, turning single track, all set out in the space of a small bungalow.
Go around corners easily. It's a single-wheel drive. It's the narrowest gauge because it's a single rail, and you can't get any smaller than a single rail.
High up in the Welsh mountains lie the ghosts of another rail system. This loco is a soldier of a revolution that mechanised these mountains. Thomas Bach, now tarted up in Thomas the Tank Engine livery, worked the De Norwich slate quarry for 60 years. Tom Roberts was one of its drivers.
Mama dechreuais I weithio yn y gwylod yma yma. Fel stocar mewn ffordd, taniwr mewn ffordd. Wedyn oeddech chi'n troi y pwynt. Oedd yr Indian ddim yn stopio neu byd I droi y pwynt. Oedd y dreifar mo'n deitha chi wedyn oeddech chi'n gwybod gwibio o'r Indian I droi y pwynt. Na ddim stopio na ddim byd. Oedd yn y chwaral oedd wahanol I fama chi. Wahanol I fama de. Chos doedd gennych chi'n cab na'n byd de. Na dim byd ar yr intis ma'n y chwaral. Oedd calad iawn de. Chydig iawn o bres de. Fwyd calad iawn de.
Thomas Bach still labours for a major Welsh industry, but tourists, not slate, are now hauled along the scenic route to Port de Norwich. Around 20 of these classic little quarry locos survive in working order. But there's only one of these that works. Alf Fisher bought it in 1960.
These engines were sold by weight in those days, you know, almost so much a pound. And I picked this one, not through any great foresight, as here was a valuable engine. It was because it was the smallest I could possibly find. And at the time I bought it, for £21, everybody said, you're mad, you know, why don't you buy a proper engine?
Though it looks more like a Meccano set, in fact, this is a proper engine. Alf's loco was one of the first to bring the Industrial Revolution to quarries.
And it was only about 1869 to 70 that somebody had the bright idea of putting steam engines in the quarries to replace the horses.
Challoner was made by a firm of marine engineers. Its upright boiler has more in common with a steamship.
This vertical boiler type of engine, for a start, it's very, very rugged and very robust, and it's very, very simple to build. Now, as far as the quarries were concerned, it was fine because it's very quick to light up and produce the heat, because it's like a kettle. In fact, it's very often called a coffee pot, is the name for this type of engine. It's also sometimes called the galloping tea urn, but never mind. We put the fire underneath, the water is above it, the heat goes straight up these tubes, and it therefore brews up very, very quickly. Whereas in a conventional engine, the heat has to pass along tubes that way and out of the chimney. So we can produce heat very, very quickly indeed. Conversely, a lot of heat is wasted and goes out of the chimney. So that's the disadvantage of it. The other thing about it is that we have to bolt the cylinders onto the front of the boiler. They are vertical as well. So instead of driving back and forwards like a conventional engine, they drive up and down. And they're bolted to the boiler there. And this means, of course, that they haven't got any springs. Now, this is all very well if you're on beautiful level track, but in the quarries, the track got a bit rough. And therefore, if you came to a bit where you had a curve and the track dipped down a bit, there's a great tendency for these engines to go straight on and come off, you see. But having said that, it's a very surprisingly smooth engine because it can't pitch about and rock about and roll as more modern engines do.
This is a more modern engine. It was built in 1902. Unlike Challoner, it was made by specialist loco engineers.
Now, whereas the De Winton engines were the successor to the horse, this little engine is the successor to the De Wintons. Now, this is the posh man's engine, or the rich quarry owners had these only a few years after the De Wintons, but these are a much more conventional engine. They have a horizontal boiler, they have the cylinders and conventional pistons and coupling rods, and they have springs. Now, these engines were not Welsh, they were built in England, and they were built by the Hunslet Company in Leeds. This little engine is a classic. I think there was probably about 100 of these built for the North Wales quarries, and very long-lasting, very durable things they were. Like the De Wintons, there's only really room for one person on these engines. In the old days, they didn't really care a great deal about the drivers. On the footplate, the controls are extremely primitive. They're basically the same as the De Winton. Very lovely to drive on a nice day.
Today, Hunslet Alice enjoys an active retirement on the Leighton Buzzard Light Railway, ironically on the sand quarry line that runs alongside a roof tile factory whose products saw off Welsh slate. Back in Wales, just a mile across the valley from where Hunslet Alice worked, is a railway whose fortunes are very different. It uses Swiss locos to make money from the mountains and hauls people, not rocks.
Mount Snowdon was a tourist attraction long before the railway was thought of. People went up on foot, on horses, on mules.
The little engines might be powerful, but no mainline passenger would tolerate an hour to do 5 miles. But as the saying goes, it's sometimes better to travel hopefully than to arrive, and Snowdon's passengers are in no hurry. Today, the railway carts 150,000 pleasure seekers up to the summit every year to enjoy the rocks, the view, and a chocolate wagon wheel. There was once a summit hotel where the leisured classes could make a weekend of it. These days, the only overnighters are the staff. The railway employs 100 people. Many are descended from workers in the defunct slate mines, like the driver of this engine, Michael Roberts, whose father was a quarryman.
Dwi'n gweithio yma ers 3 mlynedd wrth y dreifar. Da ni'n cyrraedd y copa, barod i fynd i lawr, a da ni'n tsecio yr injan drosodd boiliau, a jyst neud y saff bod ti'n barod i fynd i lawr. Oce, yr unig beth da ni'n neud bob dim sy'n symud, gyda ni'r piston, y slide bar, y falfia, da ni'n oelio hynna i gyd. Gyda ni springs, da ni'n dweud saff bod y springs yn gyfaf, bod na'm byd i torri a ni, bod y pipia, rhai o'r pipia sy'n oelio'r bogi a'r axles, dim byd torri. Os oes yna rhywbeth isio saim, da ni'n rhoi saim yn nhw. Dyna fo, really.
The survival of Snowdon's engines is testimony to their constant care. Lubrication and keeping the fire clean of clinker are essential to keep steam up for the return journey. The locos are never attached to the carriages. They are pushers on the way up and serve as a brake on the way down. Over their 100-year lifetime, each engine has done 250,000 miles. However, number 1 didn't make it beyond the first day.
Tren gyntaf sy'n fyny Wyddfa, nath nhw golli'n injan a ffordd i lawr, a ti rhedag I ffwrdd, a ti dros yr ochr. Ond yn lwcus oedd y carriage ar wahân, a ti mefoi, ond o'na rwy'n di neidio I ffwrdd ag ath o I ladd, yn anffodus.
From this inauspicious start, the Snowdon Mountain Railway has never looked back. Unlike other narrow gauge railways, whose fortunes are inseparable from industrial progress, Snowdon's natural qualities are timeless. Just like the human need for holidays, where the rat race gives way to time, space, and a little train ride to nowhere in particular.
Any more for Tannerbook, please? Any more for Tannerbook, please? Tannerbook!
Since it closed to slate traffic in 1946, the Festiniog Railway has pioneered the running of industrial trains for pleasure. The 14-mile track was built to carry finished slate to Porthmadog to be shipped all over the empire. This is the original works and railway's spiritual home. It's a temple to the fleet of 22 locos and 40 carriages, which are looked after by 1,000 or so railway devotees. In 1869, engineer Robert Fairley tailor-made a powerful loco to work within the limits of narrow gauge. This was the result.
The Fairley is a very powerful locomotive for its size. It's effectively 2 locomotives in one, so you only need 1 crew to man them, which was very important in the manning costs. It was the first articulated locomotive that worked. It has a main carrier with a boiler on top of that, with 2 articulated bogies, which are both powered. So it's a very, very powerful, very compact engine, with all of its weight being transferred onto its powered wheels. So it's able to pull very long, very heavy trains. It needs to be flexible to go round the tight contours of the line, because a line effectively follows the lines in the mountain, and it's cut into a shelf in the mountainside. So by having a locomotive that's articulated, it's able to go around the tight bends which are on this railway, which wouldn't be possible if it was a fixed, rigid wheelbase engine.
Robert Fairley's engine doubled the haulage capacity of the Festiniog and was so successful that in gratitude he waived the patent fee. As a result, modern steam Fairleys have been built that run on oil rather than coal.
We have the Earl of Meirionydd, which was built in 1977, and David Lloyd George, which was built and completed in the 1990s. They're very much the same as the original designs were. David Lloyd George is far more powerful, and the Earl of Meirionydd was built to be able to do the whole line on 1 fuelling of oil and water. So that's austerity style Fairley, if you like. My dad worked on the railway, my grandfather worked on the railway, my granddad on my mother's side worked on the railway. I wanted to be an engine driver. I'm here to fulfil my dream.
"50 years ago, after wartime service as an army loco driver, George Barlow started at the Romney, Hythe and Dymchurch Railway.
You've got a bunker of coal and a tank of water, and if you don't do things right, then you won't get there. You're making your own power going along, and it's the challenge. We had 13 ungated crossings we still have on the railway. They're controlled by lights now, but of course no one could envisage the growth of road traffic when this railway was built. You'd have an awful job to build this railway today, crossing public roads on the level 13 times in 14 miles. You're a one-man band. I mean, you've got the engine, you're a fireman, you're the driver. You've got to keep your wits about you because there's sheep and things that get on the track occasionally aren't the same scale as the engines. You mustn't run over any road that you've not looked at. You have to arrange your firing, really, according to the road.
At the end of the line, there's the promise of a Wall's ice cream, the Britannia pub, Dungeness B nuclear power station, and an obsolete lighthouse. Not exactly holiday heaven, but the ride's the thing, isn't it?
The railway has always mainly been for summer visitors and tourists, but it has had some serious traffic as well, which is not entertainment.
"70 years on, Northern Chief is one of a fleet of 9 that still roar along the Kent coast. Unlike their full-size counterparts from the 1920s, this fleet has survived intact. Narrow-gauge railways, whether built on the whim of millionaires or to slave away up Welsh mountains, all serve as miniature reminders of the great days of steam. In 1992, Manchester opened the Metrolink Light Railway. For all its microchip technology, the Metrolink is a direct descendant of the humble Victorian tram. In a world of polluted, gridlocked cities, the Metrolink saves over 2 million car journeys a year. The tram, it seems, is back.
The tram car is primarily a very, very friendly thing. It'll never do anything nasty to you. Nobody has yet managed to put a tram car to an evil purpose. It has been all to the benefit of those who use it or those who had the pleasure of actually working with the things. And no matter how you mess them about, they still remain fairly rugged, simple and reliable.
While Manchester's new tram system cost £135 million, in 1879 the Isle of Man's horse-drawn bone shakers cost considerably less and ran all day on a bag of oats. These horse tram stables in the Isle of Man have been in use for over a century. They might seem quaint now, but by the 1890s, stables like these supported a growing network of trams across Britain. At last, people had what they wanted: the freedom of their cities. Trams have gone from most cities now, but the toy town world of Douglas, the Isle of Man's capital, is still ideally suited to 1-horsepower public transport. With giddy up to get going and a crude ratchet handbrake to stop, driving a horse tram was simple enough, if the horse was willing. Electricity brought the dawn of the modern age. Along with Blackpool, the Isle of Man pioneered electric trams in Britain. Looking like something out of Jules Verne, this mercury arc rectifier transforms the AC current we get in our homes to safer and more controllable DC, direct current, suitable to power the motors in a 10-ton tram. The Isle of Man's electrical substation was refitted in 1935 and has been in perfect working order ever since. The brasswork is kept gleaming by substation attendant Joe Cleater, who tends to it daily, seemingly oblivious to the 550 volts pulsing under his brasso.
Next station, the power's on now.
The power comes off the overhead line at 550 volts DC and is picked up by the trolley pole and brought down into the cabling that's in the roof of the car. From there it comes down to the controllers here. Very, very simple things to drive our tram cars. You have the means to make it go and simply the means to make it stop.
Car number 1 is still in top-notch condition, despite being the world's oldest working electric tram. Since 1893, it has run on the Manx Electric Railway, transporting locals and greeting some welcome arrivals. Artie Wormsley worked as a conductor on these trams, but tourists weren't his only customers.
This is I used to have to change the trolley this way, you see. Right? You'd have to load the mail in with the postman that was there. But on the top of that, you had the school children to pick up. You had the milk. Sometimes there was fish down at Kinney. And then you had, of course, your passengers as well. If it was a freezing day, you had to stand at the back of the car with the trolley rope in your hand and keep hitting the trolley wires. By doing that, you kept breaking the ice all the time.
Through snowstorm and heatwave, the survival of these trams is a tribute to their manufacturers, GF Milnes & Co. But there's little that can go wrong on such a simple and cheap machine. Even when the Depression hit in the 1930s, these hardy beasts provided welcome employment for the island's locals.
If you had a job then, you thought you were the bee's knees. The pay was very, very poor indeed. Roughly 11's farthing an hour. And that was my first wage packet, which was very hard to live on.
90-hour weeks and low pay obviously took the gloss off Artie's outdoor life, but the passengers he carried appreciated the effort. In 1895, the Snaefell Mountain Tramway proved the power of electric transport, 2,000 feet above sea level.
When Snaefell Mountain Railway was planned, nobody actually knew for sure that an electric car would propel itself at a 1 in 12 gradient by adhesion alone. Hence, the potential to put additional motors to drive wheels against the fell rail, the centre rail, which in the event were not necessary because an electric tram car would climb a 1 in 9 if necessary without any additional help. It was clever.
Although the central rail was never used for traction on the ascent, it was certainly needed for the way down. The Snaefell brakesman can still rely on elbow grease to stop a runaway. Isolation has helped the Isle of Man stay locked in its time capsule. But on the mainland, as trams met the demands of the 20th century, they had to modernise. Or face the power going off for good. The six-wheeled 3F was a common sight on local lines, like this one that meandered through Nottinghamshire's coalfields. Although mainly used for shunting, a 3F could haul an entire freight train as long as it had a guard.
The guard was in charge of the train. The reason that he was in charge of the train was in case there was a derailment or an accident, the guard had to protect the train.
The guard was there because the driver needed all his concentration just to control the train.
With a passenger train, you've got a continuous brake. But with these, you'd only got the brake on the engine.
And these trains had loose couplings, so going downhill, the rear wagons would bump into those in front. And going uphill, they'd all snatch apart and could even break away.
There's areas where you could have a train of 62 wagons on 3 different gradients. So it was very, very skillful.
Once again, the job was made easier by the guard, who controlled a handbrake in his van at the rear.
When you was going down the down gradient, it was up to the guard to apply his brake so as to keep the wagons taut. So when he got to the end of the basin and started rising again, it stopped all this snatching, and then the train didn't break in two. And that's why the guard had to learn the road. He got to know when he was on a falling gradient, he'd got to know when he was on the level. When you was on the level, you didn't use your brake unless you was being stopped at a signal, then you needed assistance. But other than that, you left it to the driver.
Well, this special arm we're on now, it was more or less continuously in use. 24 hours a day. And you were at it all day long, up and down all day long, shunting, quite a busy job. You come to work, you was designated 8 hours, but sometimes it might take you 10. Once I was at work 20 hours and a half, so you no food or anything.
It was inconvenient, of course. There was no toilets. We kept the stove going in the winter time to keep you warm, and we used to have a wire around it with one of those steel cans on to keep the water warm, to have a drink, a cup of tea if we wanted one. But it wasn't a lonely life because you got to be concentrating on the signalling and knowing where you was.
BR decided to modernise and standardise. It began in 1952 with a diesel shunter, the 08.
These engines would leave a depot at 6 a.m. Monday morning, go to faraway sidings, and they'd be there till Saturday or Sunday of the following week. When you wanted to mash your tea, as you see in the corner there's a cooker, and also you could cook your bacon and egg in the morning there, or hot meat, pies, anything like that.
The 08 looked like an electric cooker because this diesel engine didn't turn any wheels. It was a generator for the individual electric motors which turned each axle, creating enormous traction. There were plenty of brakes too. The 08 had to be compatible with every wagon owned by BR.
And this engine has got all the 3 braking systems on it. And if you include the handbrake, then that's the 4th type of brakes that's required on British Rail even today.
This is one of the 2 air brakes, and this is one of the 2 mechanical brakes. The 08 was an early triumph for diesel power. Over 1,000 were made, and many are still in use today. Barrington village is dissected by a local goods line that connects the nearby quarry to the main line. Once a week, these sluggish 30-year-old Sentinel diesels haul a coal train through the village. It takes them 20 minutes to complete the mile-long route. Beeching must be turning in his grave. But this underused local link makes door-to-door delivery by rail possible. and that is what makes it economic to send the coal down the main line. And the locals like the way the coal is kept off the roads. Well, almost. In fact, only 8% of freight is delivered by rail now. A once great industry has almost disappeared. But if the motorways get clogged with juggernaut jams, perhaps rail freight will return.
Enginemanship and the learning of enginemanship could be seen as a kind of discipleship at the feet of this machine. You have a driver who has all the knowledge and all the learning and all the skills. You have his disciple, who's the fireman, who's at his feet learning these skills. And the fireman, in the process of producing steam and power for the driver's hand, is actually performing a form of alchemy. He's combining the elements of earth, coal, air, oxygen, and water. And with the magic of his skills, he's producing the power that drives this machine along.
From 1948, this Battle of Britain class loco hauled crack express trains for British Rail's southern region. It was operated by engine drivers like Clive Groom.
And with luck, we'll start away without slipping. I'm unleashing very destructive powers here. If I do it wrong, within 100 seconds, the engine will thrash itself to pieces. There's amazing power in these things. I'm looking to him when the signals are his side. I'm looking to him to provide the steam when I need it. He's doing his job, I'm doing my job, but I'm reliant on him totally for what I've got under here.
Got a green flag.
Right? You couldn't be a driver if you couldn't fire an engine, because you couldn't supervise your fireman if you didn't know what he should be doing.
Though it looks like simple shoveling, the firing of a loco requires great skill to maintain steam pressure.
The pressure has to be such that you've got power under the regulator when you need it, and the heat of the steam, which is called superheat, depends on the colour of the fire. So we can get 750 degrees Fahrenheit in the steam if we've got 2,500 degrees Fahrenheit in the fire. It all depends on him. I'm listening to the beat of the engine. I'm listening to the rail joints for my speed. I don't necessarily rely on the speedometer up there. In fact, in the early days we had no speedos. We did it all by sound. I can tell when the engine's picking up its water. I can tell by smell when the engine is superheating. There's a nutty smell from the oil in the front end when the engine's superheating. And the reaction to the controls is like a supercharged car.
This is Castle-class loco Defiant. It was a type designed in 1923 to haul express trains for the Great Western Railway.
The Castle class represents for me the epitome of locomotive design of the time. And of course, they look nice. I have the taper boiler and all the brass work and copper work, which in itself doesn't do anything for a locomotive's performance, but certainly sets them off. And their performance, the records that they set up, particularly on the Cheltenham Flyer, the whole thing just comes together as a splendid piece of machinery. I think they're wonderful.
Footplate crews on God's Wonderful Railway, as GWR was known to its loyal fans, thought their engines were wonderful too, which was a good job because crew comfort was rather a low priority. There was little weather protection and no seats. But there were some compensations.
By modern standards, or by later standards, the castles are a bit Spartan. They're relatively straightforward to drive. They're very responsive to both the fireman and the driver, and they were very fast. And one of the advantages of the castle was that it kept its good riding characteristics even when it was fairly warm. When Collett built the castles, he introduced an optical alignment system into Swindon Works, which enabled them to reduce the tolerances on all the moving parts to the very bare minimum. And as a result, of course, they started off with a considerable advantage over those built in other railways. It is said that at that time, Swindon scrapped locomotives or put them in for a major overhaul at wear tolerances that the London North Eastern turned out as new. And people remarked that although the Great Western had said quite truthfully that the Castle was the most powerful locomotive in Britain, it was very much smaller in appearance than Flying Scotsman. And I think the result of this was to sharpen the minds of the railway fraternity in particular.
In the mid-1930s, the fad for futuristic streamlining was at fever pitch. Most was a victory of form over function. Not only were the A4s aerodynamically successful, but they helped solve the engine driver's nightmare, drifting smoke.
You must be able to see the signals ahead down the long boiler. His vision isn't very good at the best of times, but you can't see anything if the smoke is beating across from the side wind and obscuring the view from the cab.
In the belief that the streamlined shape would help lift the smoke clear of the cab, Nigel Gresley tried different shaped models in a wind tunnel. But nothing worked until Eric put his finger on the problem.
The technical assistant, Eric Bannister, who was involved in the experiment, was actually holding a plasticine model in his hand, and he held it with his thumb behind the chimney and made a depression behind the chimney by mistake. And they put the model in the wind tunnel and found for the first time they'd succeeded in lifting the smoke clear of the cab. The cab of the Gresley locomotive was extremely comfortable for the driver and the fireman, compared to many other companies where the cab was rather austere. But you could drive the A4 from a sitting position, all the controls within the driver's reach, and the fireman was provided also with a bucket seat. And with a wide firebox locomotive, you don't need to fire the locomotive continuously.
Through the austerity years of the 1950s, steam was still cheaper than diesels. But the tide was turning, and the threat to Gresley's magnificent A4s came from this.
They're an interesting machine to drive because of the amount of power that you've got at hand. They're unique in the fact that they're fitted with 2 diesel engines and generators. They were the only production class of diesel-electric locomotive built with 2 engine and generator sets. The good thing about the driving position in a Deltic is the all-round good visibility, which you didn't really have on steam.
"22 Deltics replaced 55 steam locos hauling express trains up the east coast. The Deltics brought an end to an era that had lasted 150 years.
The expense of the machinery that was put into the hands of these quite simple, unlettered men was extraordinary. The locomotives were not only lethal, they travelled at quite considerable speeds, they cost an awful lot to build, and the men in charge had no one to supervise them. They were the largest body of unsupervised men in the country, some 70,000 drivers and firemen at one time.
The first time I went at a considerable rate, I thought my last hour had come. But then I thought to myself it was a bloody fine way to die and resign myself to death.